All right. Good morning, Doug. We have some interesting things to talk about today. Lots of viewer questions, but first, I feel like we have to address this new bill that's going through the House at this point and was touted by Biden a couple of days ago, called the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. What do you think, Doug? Your reading of this bill so far, what do you think? Is it going to reduce inflation?
First thing I think is that these people are really good at naming bills to do exactly the Orwellian opposite of what will actually happen. So you've got the thing in front of you, I guess. I don't, but having read it, they're spending billions and billions of dollars on basically pork barrel projects where who knows where the money is going or who will get it, or it's going to enrich the usual suspects. It's not going to reduce inflation. It's going to destroy capital and destroy the dollar. It's totally perverse. These are horrible, dangerous people.
Yeah, they are extremely good at naming things, though. You're right, because they, they go, what's the biggest criticism of this bill likely to be? Well, listen, we're already struggling from inflation in America. If we blow another 370 billion, probably gonna make inflation worse. Okay, well, let's call it the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know how many listeners will remember, but when Clinton was in office, just after the Soviet Union fell, there was supposed to be a $50 billion peace dividend because we weren't going to have to, arm up to fight the evil empire anymore. $50 billion, that seemed like a gigantic amount of money even then. Well, it's just a rounding error even on this stupid bill. It's just amazing.
Yeah, in fact, there's a portion of this bill, mostly it's promoting green energy ideas. That's what it's like, tax credits and grants and things like that for green energy. But there's 60 billion, so 10 billion more than the alleged peace dividend that Clinton talked about, that's devoted to something they call environmental justice. So specifically,
justice.
Yeah, it says basically it's sending new investments to communities long exposed to greater levels of pollution than wealthier and often wider areas.
Who might that be? Where will they send it?
I'm guessing it's an excuse to send money to the urban, to New York and to Baltimore and to LA and these urban environments, which are substantially non-white, and they could argue that there's greater air pollution in those places and things like that. But I think it looks like it's probably a payoff to the blue cities in America.
Yeah, perhaps they'll airdrop the money to the ruins of Pruitt-Igoe and Cabrini Green and these other, giant vertical ghettos that they built.
Right.
Maybe they'll build new ones. I mean, this is absolutely insane. These people, I play poker, and when you watch somebody who's become a pathological loser and he just doesn't care about anything, you call him on tilt. And the US government is on tilt. They're just spending money pathologically at this point. This is amazing stuff.
Okay. And on that note, I guess it's worthy of asking you another question about news this week. And that is that we entered a technical recession which we discussed, a week or two ago, that the definition of it was two consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. And just like with the Orwellian attack on, not calling this bill what it should be called, which is like a green energy pork barrel spending or something like that. They refuse to call a recession a recession. They've worked hard to change the definition of it. In fact, they changed the definition in Wikipedia for recession from
in Wikipedia. Wow.
Yeah, and then they locked it for future changes. So they said, no, it's final now. It's been redefined. And the real war seems to be on words here. If you use the right words, then everything will be okay.
Yeah, it's been said before, but I think I've got to say it again, that 1984 was supposed to be a warning, not an instruction manual. And changing, I mean, overtly changing the definitions of words. Well, that's nothing new, because it used to be that the word recession, I mean, these words they're all floating abstractions. It's very stupid. What are they going to say if the economy actually collapses? And will they recognize that something called the Greater Depression, which is a concept that I've been putting forward for some years, is actually here? Anyway, I hope the Democrats are in office when it happens, because maybe they'll take the blame for it, or the blame will be given to them. But no, that's dangerous, because if they're in office when it happens, that will be an excuse to lock down further. I don't see there's any way out of this thing. They'll keep changing the words, meanings, and confusing people. And the average American, once again, I'll refer people to Mark Dice's videos where he interviews the average American, knows nothing about nothing. This is actually pretty grim.
Yeah. What do you think? You know, the one of the key arguments of why it's not a recession, though, is they say, well, the employment market is so strong. And it's true, the unemployment rate is extremely low. It's also true that just driving around the US in the last month, help wanted signs everywhere, paying extraordinary amounts of money. I mean, just a clerk in the mall, $19 an hour, part-time, $60,000 a year, full-time. I mean, and there are lots of places that have to have shortened hours because they just can't get the staff to support, the restaurant's normal operations. Like, so that their argument that one thing they're saying is that the employment's so strong, it's not really a recession. How do you make of this weird situation where we do have a strong labor market, lots of job openings, wages have been pushed up a lot, and yet clearly, the economy is shrinking?
Well, Mises, many, many years ago, came up with the concept of a crack-up boom. In other words, crack-up boom. The economy is collapsing. Standard of living is dropping, but there's a lot of economic activity in the markets because of all the money that's been created, and people are buying things. Some people are because they've become temporarily rich. Other people are being forced to work because they're approaching penury. So the economy isn't booming, but I think it's relates to the Misesian concept of a crack-up boom. Lots of activity caused by all this purchasing media. I mean, you remember when Bernanke said years ago, he said, well, if things get really bad, we can actually drop money from helicopters. And everybody thought, ha, that's very funny. He's got a sense of humor. But that is precisely and exactly what they've done by creating trillions of dollars. So
nothing makes sense anymore, though. The dislocations everywhere. I mean, even when they raised interest rates last week or earlier this week, you see the 10-year yield goes down in that environment. I mean, it's strange. There's a lot, the normal indicators don't make sense anymore, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
No, they don't. The markets are going up and down like an elevator with the lunatic at the controls. One thing I found quite interesting, however, was now here we are on a Friday talking. I'm not sure when this thing will actually be released to the public for technical reasons. But gold has gone up about $60, indeed $70 in the last few days.
Oh, wow.
From out of nowhere. Silver went up $1.10 in one day after a long period of
decline.
Is the worm turning? I don't know, but I think all of the markets are going to be going up and down like an elevator with a lunatic at the controls. Good analogy, because we actually do have a lunatic at the controls, or a bunch of lunatics, these Bolsheviks and Jacobins in Washington.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get into some of these viewer questions. Now, viewers, when you have questions,
let me compliment you on your sartorial elegance. It appears we're using the same tailor, even though you're out west and I'm on the East Coast at the moment.
Good sense of style, Doug. It's contagious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get into some viewer questions now. Viewers, if you have questions, the best thing to do is there's a link to our Telegram group in the description of this video and all of them that we do. Join the Telegram group. I solicit questions from that group, and then we answer as many of them as we can here. So if you have questions, join the Telegram group. So, Doug, someone asks, they know both of us live in Uruguay for a good part of the year. What do you think? Are Uruguayans in general hostile towards the unvaccinated?
Mhm. God, I hate to generalize because I don't associate with the broad swath of Uruguayan society. At this point, many more Uruguayans than I do. Not sure what to say, Matt. What do you think?
Well, I would say Uruguayans are generally not conflict-oriented people. So, I feel like that the people that I've talked to about it, they might have an opinion about it, but I didn't see them necessarily look at people who are unvaccinated as being, the cause of the pandemic, or I never heard anyone say it was a pandemic of the unvaccinated or anything like that in Uruguay. So I think that people are generally not into conflict, but I also I do know that compliance was very high there. Compliance was very high with mask wearing when when they were mandated indoors there. And the vaccination rate is also very high, although they use different vaccines than the American vaccines for a good part of it. So,
well, how about this? Recently, the Uruguayan government has taken some kind of action against Pfizer. What was that exactly?
Yeah, no, this is really nice, and this is the benefit of an independent judiciary. So basically, there was a court case brought to when they were expanding the vaccines for children below the age of 13. And in the court case, they wanted to prove the efficacy of it before they gave it to kids. That's what the whoever was filed the case was after. And the judge actually ordered the government and Pfizer to release details about the contract between the government and Pfizer, as well as the ingredients of the vaccine. Pfizer did not respond to that, and so there was an injunction held essentially that people under 13 could not then be vaccinated, and that's basically where it was left last I heard. But that was amazing. I mean, an independent judiciary can do things like this in every country in the world virtually, and it was wonderful to see this thing happening where we spend a lot of our time.
Well, I'm glad it is, because the reports that we get are anecdotal, and even if they're written up in scientific journals, they are not widely disseminated among the public. So the public doesn't know anything except what they hear in the mass media. But it does appear that there's an epidemic of not just myocarditis, which can be very dangerous, I understand, among perfectly healthy young and middle-aged people, but all kinds of nasty things that are oddly correlated to these vaccines that people were basically forced to take. My suspicion is that this is going to become a major, major scandal.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard people say that it's the largest crime perpetrated on any people anywhere, because it's so broadly based and was done without informed consent. People didn't understand the consequences of it. They felt like it was always safe and effective, and there was evidence, according to the Pfizer documents that were ordered to be released by a U.S. judge, that even in the early stages, Pfizer had strong reason to believe that it wasn't anywhere near as effective as they were publicly proclaiming.
So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what will the consequences of this be, assuming that what I think is the truth starts coming out? Is Bubis Americanus going to blame corporations in general as being profit grubbing and corrupting the government? Or are they going to say, wait a minute, the government's completely out of control. They forced this upon us. The corporations can't force this on us. So who are they going to blame? And what are the consequences of it going to be? I don't think it's going to be towards a freer world. I think it'll perversely be towards a more regulated and locked down world, just the opposite of what should happen. My guess.
I think so too. And I also think there's for the people who chose, the vast majority of people who chose to get vaccinated and to who chose that, even if it becomes clear that that was a mistake, it's going to be very hard for them to recognize the error in their judgment. I mean, or to want to recognize the error in their judgment. And it's just as likely, I think, that they could be looking for a scapegoat, somebody to blame it on, and make it go away, because it's just, it became such a, who's that guy, Matthias Desmet, the whole mass formation guy that popularized that idea. People's psychological identity essentially has been so tied with their actions around this COVID hysteria that it's really hard to see that dissembling without causing a lot of chaos in one form or another. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. This is one of those periods when the world goes through, it's like what happened in Salem in the 17th century, but on a worldwide scale. It's really quite terrifying, and it ain't over yet. I mean, we still have COVID 2.0. I mean, don't forget, we went through, let's see, swine flu, bird flu, Asian flu, Hong Kong flu, a bunch of different flus, which were basically nothing. All the while, people forgetting that from the normal seasonal flu, 30 to 60,000 Americans die every year just from the normal seasonal flu. And now this is SARS and
monkeypox now, monkeypox.
Monkeypox. I can't believe that that's actually going to get traction, but anything's possible in this crazy world we're living in.
Yeah, and one other thing I did hear just on this, and we'll get a strike for even talking about this topic. It's quite possible we'll get a strike on our YouTube channel for everything we've already said, but we're going to leave it and see what happens. But I think that, I saw recently that that in September there will be updated boosters released. So Pfizer is updating their, the formula essentially to account for the new variants that are not apparently being, that to make it essentially more effective against the new variants. So there will be a whole new cause for a whole revaccination run if there's an updated formula released.
Well, in a way, I can't wait to see what happens. On the other hand, I can wait for the rest of my life to see that it doesn't happen. I mean, this is, it's just crazy. Anyway, Uruguayans and vaccines and all that, I don't know. Look, they're just people, but.
Yep. Okay. How close are we to being completely disarmed by the government here in the US? The reptiles in Congress don't seem to be holding back.
No, they don't. That's another trend that I don't think you can turn around. I mean, people get terrified by what they hear on TV and the newspapers, and they figure, wow, this is a problem, got to do something. So the government will do something, and do something always means more regulations and more. So the trend is still in motion towards taking your guns away. And how are you going to resist them? I mean, I used to say that when Hitler imposed severe gun control laws on Germany, when the Nazis took over in 1933, if the Jews had resisted, and then when the Gestapo came by to round up individual families, if they'd been met with the fusillade of bullets, would we have had Auschwitz and Buchenwald and all that? Well, I don't know. But the way it actually works is this, is if one individual or a family resists a couple of officers that come by to do bad things to you, they send a squad by. And if that's not enough, they'll send a platoon by. And there's no end to it because they're well organized and well armed and well funded. And we're just a mob. That's why peasant revolts almost never succeed. So I guess that's a long answer to the question is yes, the anti-gun nonsense is going to continue and it will accelerate, in my opinion.
Right. And if you think
hope I'm wrong, hope I'm dead wrong.
I hope so too. But I mean, there are two big examples in my life of this that I recall, and one was Waco. If you don't know about what happened in Waco because you're too young, you should really review that case because it's pretty astonishing what the ATF and the FBI did in that. And then also the Ruby Ridge case, both examples of people who really just wanted to be left alone, really weren't doing anything really wrong, and the government came down on them. And when it didn't go well at first, they just accelerated, got bigger and harder and violent.
Yeah, and I was living in Aspen at the time, and just randomly asked a few associates, friends, about what they thought, and they said, "Well, those people deserved it. They were abusing children. They were a crazy cult. They were dangerous." So almost everybody defended the government's actions, even though they wound up barbecuing. Was it 90 people in Waco?
Yeah,
I forget. It was a large number.
Yeah, dozens of children were burnt alive. So
Yeah.
I guess they deserved. They were saving the children from something by doing that, apparently.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was absolutely no rational reason why that had to happen. It was actually insane. But the average American defended the state as being correct. So yeah, the negative trend towards gun stuff will basically continue, I think. Red
All right,
flag
Doug.
laws, God knows what.
Exactly. Yep. Doug, do you see a shift of global power from west to east? Will there be two separate systems, one in a dollar, ever shrinking sphere, and one in a so-called Sino-Russian prosperous sphere? Just like with the Roman Empire collapse, the western part saw a dark age while the eastern remained prosperous until the Ottoman conquest?
Yeah, that's a pretty complex answer that is warranted here, because, on the one hand, you got to say, with the huge, much delayed great leap forward that the Chinese made, starting with Deng Xiaoping in 1980, I mean, it's really quite incredible the way China has leaped forward. But on the other hand, I think that all of the Chinese banks are bankrupt. My opinion is that the Belt and Road Initiative is going to turn out to be a huge boondoggle, which is going to wind up antagonizing all these countries that the Chinese have built infrastructure that suits them in. So China could actually fly apart, and they could go back to a situation like the warlords in the 1920s. I mean, there's no guarantee that China's gonna hang together. Once their banks go bust, which they probably will, because they've lent, hundreds of billions of dollars on everything from the road. What the hell? I'm thinking like Biden now. Can't think of the word. Anyway, this mega project of the Chinese, plus scores of cities built unoccupied in the middle of nowhere, and bridges and roads in the middle of nowhere. These banks go bust, pension funds go bust, the stock market goes bust. These are all done by companies. And Mrs. Wu, when she goes to get her yuan out of the bank, she'll be very, very unhappy, saving 50% of her income and finding that she either can't get the yuan. This is happening now, incidentally. Yep. Or later, the yuan is worth nothing. This could be explosive in China.
Yeah, not only that, I saw a statistic on Zero Hedge yesterday or the day before that the youth unemployment rate in China right now is 19.3%. That's like double the youth unemployment rate in the US. I think that's like ages like 16 to 26. Now, that's the group that sets stuff on fire if things aren't going well for them. And to have a large percentage of the population unemployed, I think really is a dangerous situation there for them.
Especially since you don't want to forget the one-child policy, which was in effect in China for a generation and a half anyway. Yep. So you've got this huge wave of unmarried young men without females to hang around with. I mean, and there's nothing, the most dangerous animal in the history of the planet, more dangerous than the Tyrannosaurus Rex, is the young unmarried male. So they've got lots of those. And the other thing, all these factories in China, which have benefited the whole world, cranking out cheap stuff, as the standard of living in the rest of the world goes down, well, they're not going to be making stuff or selling stuff. And, there will be trade barriers against them. So more unemployed people and bankrupt factories. I think that a great part of the Greater Depression, like everything else in the world today, is going to be made in China, actually.
Right.
Partially.
I mean, you imagine if they have lots of internal chaos there, and that makes them less able or less reliable producers of the goods and services that the world relies on. The entire world relies on them as some seriously important components in every supply chain, basically. You can imagine the effect you could have a real supply crisis, essentially, if they are unable for whatever reason to continue to produce the things that the world needs. I mean, you could go into a serious decline in the standard of living of everyone around the world if for some reason they have internal conflict that starts to affect that, which it looks like it's on the way.
Yeah, it does. And everybody's counting on. So I guess the question was, if the world breaks up into two blocks, is everything going to be hunky-dory in the Russia-China block? I think no. And it's definitely not going to be well, it's going to be, once again, going back to Orwell, where you had East Asia, Eurasia, and Oceania were the three powers in the world. I mean, it's funny how predictive sci-fi can be.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah,
because they were all dystopian.
Exactly. And they were all at war with each other at various times for various reasons.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. So next question. It's a 27-year-old. He says, I hear people talking about buying stocks during the dip. What about real estate? Isn't it the best time to buy now as well, even though interest rates are high? Like, so he's basically asking, he's buying into the idea that you should buy the dip with stocks. I think he's implying that now is a dip, and he's also implying that now is a dip in real estate. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think I understand he's trying to figure this stuff out. But first of all, are interest rates high? I mean, relative to what? If you go back to, this isn't quite ancient history yet, but the early 1980s, you paid 14% for a mortgage if you could get one. The US government at the peak was paying 19% to borrow money. So interest rates are actually quite low relative to historic levels where they've been. And sure, they've gone up a lot recently, but from levels that amount to zero, and they're still negative. Interest rates are still negative relative to the depreciation of the currency. But, trying to predict interest rates, I've told that joke about Einstein goes to heaven here. Predicting interest rates is very, very hard to do. I think they're generally going up. But the problem with real estate is it floats on a sea of debt. So interest rates do go up, it's going to hurt real estate. And interest rates, and look, this is a real problem. The one thing you want to remember is, yes, you want to have real assets, real wealth, and you do want to have a place that you can call your own, that you can live and store your stuff in. So what should you do? Should you be buying stocks on it? No, we've had a 40-year bull market with artificially inflated earnings. And the only stocks I'm interested in buying, and I am interested in buying them, are oil stocks, natural gas stocks, mining stocks, gold stocks in particular, and uranium stocks. That's about it. I mean, if the market gets as cheap as it's gotten many times just in my lifetime, it can get much, much cheaper. And of course, tech stocks, many of them have already fallen 50, 80, 90%. Many are on their way to bankruptcy. I don't know. What's your view on this, Matt?
Well, I think the whole mantra of buy the dip is a bull market mantra. It works in a bull market, and it's actually just, it's awful advice when you're not in an obvious bull market. You know, and so like lots of people were saying, you know, when Bitcoin was at, you know, when it fell from 67 down to 55, it was like buy the dip. And then we said when 55 to 50, buy the dip, 55 to 35, buy the dip. If you're doing that same approach with buying stocks over the last 6 or 9 months, like that certainly is, you're way underwater. And I think the same thing if you're buying the dip, it's this minor dip that we've experienced in real estate so far. I mean, sellers have just begun to discount now, just begun. So
Just
the
because-
discounting isn't even started yet. So I think it's going to get a lot cheaper. And I think one of the things when you're 27 and it's really hard to understand how the markets are going to respond when you go into a bear market. And for, you know, I'm lucky enough to have survived 2 of these things in my lifetime. So the dot-com boom and bust, and then the financial crisis in 2008. Both times, even though I thought it was going to happen, I made the wrong decision about how to trade it both times. You know, and so because it's just way more complicated than you think when the markets really get sucked into a major downdraft. And so you have to be very, very careful. And the cavalier idea of buy the dip is, man, it works great in a bull market, but I think you got to be very, very careful now.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's one more thing. When people are still talking about buying the dip, it means that they're still pretty optimistic about the market. When you really want to buy is when nobody wants to even hear about the stock market. We're a long way from there. So I guess the answer that our friend is looking for is, what should I do with my money right now? And what should you do with your money? I still, look, we're in the twilight zone where nothing is really cheap. And that seems metaphysically impossible to say nothing is really cheap in a bargain. But as close as you can get, gold stocks and oil stocks are about as cheap as you can get. So if you're going to buy anything, buy them, buy some gold coins, put them away, buy a piece of real estate with the longest fixed rate mortgage you can get, because you're still, even at 6%, you're still paying negative 3% or 5 or even 10% in interest. Do that. I mean, that's kind of simple. And learn to speculate, but don't confuse speculation with gambling, which everybody winds up doing. Look, this is a real problem. I hate to pontificate as to what someone should do, because over what time frame? Over
This
a
is the
month,
question.
a year,
This is the question.
10 years, over a lifetime? I mean, this is very problematical.
Well, so
And
you're
things
talking like,
change constantly.
and I think this really matters. Like when I think about buying real estate, for instance, if you don't imagine, if you're not fairly confident that you're going to be in that property for a decade or more, you shouldn't buy it. I don't think either, because especially now we know we're basically we're next to the top of the market for real estate. Yes, interest rates are going to go up, and but that's going to push real estate prices down. I mean, so
Yep.
the value, if you buy anything, even at this low interest rate today, you're going to be underwater in 2 years, probably, because it will lose value. So yeah, I think the time frame is the big question. And I just think it's time to be cautious. If you have extra cash, if you have resources, I think you just need to be very careful with them.
Yeah, and just a historical reference is that during the last depression, during the 1930s, many properties were available for back taxes alone. And that was at a time when most people did not have mortgages on their houses. And if they did have mortgages, it was with 20% down payments, and they were 5-year mortgages. Little known fact, but you were able to buy lots of stuff for back taxes alone. Could it happen again? Yeah, there's a lot more debt in the world today. Taxes are a much bigger element. So, but on the other hand, listen, you want a place that you own, and it's good to have a mortgage inflating out of existence if you're going to keep the place for 10 years. It's so tough to give relevant, good advice within a meaningful time frame to somebody out there in the ether.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. Okay. Doug, somebody asked, relating to, we were talking about China earlier, what do you think is going on with the Chinese banking crisis now? Is it actually a banking crisis, or are we just starting to see some banks start to collapse?
I think we just talked about that. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think this next crisis has the potential to be really serious in China,
Okay.
with political implications and God knows what. I mean, that's a reason for Xi not to attack Taiwan, but then again, it's a reason for him to attack Taiwan, to direct
The
people's
energy outward.
attention to an external enemy. Don't be unpatriotic. We've got a much more serious problem that we've created across the straits.
Right. And all you young employed men, we have a new job for you in the military.
That's right. Dangerous, unpredictable times. It's funny because the way things can develop in almost any direction. And we were talking before the show about a novel that I'm reading now that was well reviewed. So I bought it, and it's called Civilizations. I forget the name of the author. I hadn't heard of him before. He's a European. He's French, as a matter of fact. And it's alternative history. What would have happened if Columbus had failed and his expedition, he was captured and died and never went back to Spain with news of the New World. And instead, through a series of circumstances that are reasonable, the natives in the New World, get the kind of technology that Columbus had on his boats and turn the tables on the Europeans. And this book, Civilizations, is the name of the novel, probably, I think, worth reading, of how the entire world could have been different just with an accident. Columbus dying as opposed to succeeding could have happened.
Yeah.
So in this context, anything can happen today.
Doug, why is it that in basically every environment, no matter if it's business or politics, the stupid and the assholes tend to be the leaders, while the normal people with good understanding of life tend to work or take place at the lowest levels of an organization? Like, why is it that the shit rises to the top of any organization?
Yes. Well, one answer I've always given to that is there are many ways of dividing people, but one way is you've got people that like to control physical reality, build things, move things, stuff. And then you've got people that like to control other people, and they go into politics and they can make great promises. So that's why those people rise to the top, because manipulating people is actually much more remunerative than the hard work of manipulating atoms. So that's one reason. Then who is this guy that wrote a book about stupidity, which is a very interesting subject. I mean, the nature of stupidity. I define stupidity in a couple of ways. One way is stupidity is the inability to not just predict the immediate and direct effects of actions. That's obviously stupid. But then you've got second order stupidity, inability to predict not the immediate and direct, but the delayed and indirect effects of consequences of actions. So you got that all over the place too. And then another good definition of stupidity is it's an unwitting tendency to self-destruction. So, people go through times of psychological depression where they just don't care, or they want to lash out against other people. And sometimes that's witting self-destruction. But then there's unwitting self-destruction where they just don't figure out what's happening. And then you've got a certain number of people that are basically brigands and thieves and criminals for whatever reason. We can determine why, but you got this element out there that are doing things. And, a lot of people that just like to live peaceful, calm lives, they're conflict averse. And so they get pushed around by these, maybe I'm taking too gloomy a view, because the ascent of man actually has been going on for at least 5,000 years or more. It
Yep.
should continue, long trend in motion.
Yeah, but it's hard to argue the idea that clearly stupid people are in charge of, are at the controls at this point. I mean, whether it's that they don't understand the second order consequences of their decisions, sending $60 billion of weapon systems to Ukraine, for instance, or passing an inflation, stopping inflation bill that really inflates things. Maybe, if nothing else, they are stupid people who are in charge today in these government organizations, and seemingly the business organizations as well, because they're going headlong into the ESG and equity ideas, So the dumb people are in charge, or not dumb, the stupid people are in charge right now.
Maybe it's even worse than that, because stupid is bad enough, but then you've got evil people, and evil is a word that has kind of been discredited by all these Bible Belt preachers that, spew venom at people that don't follow their religions. Evil. But I think evil exists. We got to define evil. And to me, evil is being intentionally destructive. Okay. So you got a lot of those people out there too. But the fact is I look at the people in Washington, D.C. and the people in Ottawa. These people are actually stupid, and a lot of them are actually evil. They're intentionally destructive. I mean, look at Biden. I mean, stupid, evil. Well, Kamala, look at all these people underneath them, and several layers down where they've, put people in there that kind of back them up in their ideas. How can this end well?
It doesn't end well. It must, I think the metaphor I like using is the toilet must be flushed before something new can come. You just got to get rid of the old. Klaus in this way is right. Like, something does need to be reset. I mean, I hate to admit it, but he seems correct.
Yeah, the problem is I don't think we're the ones who are going to get to do the resetting. No. Chances are better that Klaus is going to be the one that decides who gets reset.
I think you're right. I guess I was saying I agree with it theoretically and philosophically, but when it gets down to the practical approach, I totally disagree on every level.
Yeah, it's it's just amazing. On the other hand, I feel like, well, I can't do anything to change the course of history like Klaus can. Klaus is changing the course of history, but maybe you don't have to. Maybe all you got to do is influence a couple other people, and that's the most you can do.
Yep, I think.
Don't be one of the idiots that are influenced by the bad guys. Just doing that helps. But if you can actually positively influence a couple people, or maybe 10 or 20 or 100. I'd like to think we're doing that.
I think you've gotten more than 100, Doug, but yeah, I think you're right. Positive, the idea of changing, and I think is what a lot of people feel like with what's happening. They feel like you have to get in there and change something, either through the political process or through some other means, and that seems totally futile in my mind, and I know in yours as well. And but there are things you can do in the real world around you to make things good, to build still a positive life. Like, it doesn't mean just because disaster is coming and is here in many ways, in many places, does not mean there has to be disaster actually in your life.
Yeah, charity begins at home. So first of all, change yourself physically and psychologically, spiritually, mentally, and then be a good influence on your family and then on your friends, and then wish the world well.
That's a good idea. Okay, Doug, do you have any take on Sark or maybe any of the other larger crown dependencies?
That's funny, because there's a small Zoom group that we're both members of, and one of our members sees Sark as being a very interesting thing. It's like really semi-independent in many, many ways. Small, it's only got like 500 residents, but so it's not like it's in the middle of the Channel Islands, close to the coast of France. I've never been there. And it's not easy to get there. You got to get there by boat or a seaplane or something like that. But it's pleasant if you can stock up with plenty of good things to eat and entertain yourselves. But political sovereignty is extremely valuable. Sark has it, and very interesting.
Well, and our friend there is making a real play, and seems like he's succeeding at recruiting enough like-minded people that they would have a lot of political control over what happens there. So he's making a lot of progress.
And it could be a pleasant enough place to live. But like, as in most cases, you really should have capital so that you can do things once you get there and sustain yourself in the manner that you'd like to be sustained. So, well, of course, it might be a good place for somebody that's penniless, that has skills to go to also.
Exactly. Yeah.
But interesting. So Sark is worth looking into. And if you're close to England or France, I think it would be very interesting. Let me suggest to our listeners, yeah, go to Sark and spend some time and take a look. Good idea.
Yeah, and if you just do some Googling on Sark, you'll discover our friend Sven, and he has lots of information that he's put out there, lots of interviews he's done on Sark, and he makes a pretty compelling case for why it is a place of the future. And he's moved there himself on a permanent basis. I think it was like 5 years ago or so, and he's been really working to build it since then and build the community there. So it's very, very interesting, and he makes an incredibly compelling case. So I definitely encourage people to check it out.
Exactly, and I think he and his confederates on Sark would welcome people of the type that listen to our podcast. So go to Sark, take a look, and tell us what you think.
Exactly, I'd love to hear. Okay, Doug, what are the biggest differences you've seen in the U.S. on this summer, back in the U.S. versus last summer in the U.S.? I know, in your time out and about, is there any noticeable change for the better or the worse?
Well, I'm living in a silo here in the U.S., venturing out occasionally like a marmot sticking its head above its hole to survey, what's going on around it. And here where I am, in a backwater, on the water place in Virginia, everything is still mellow and normal. And I went to Las Vegas. Did we talk about this in our last
Yeah, we did talk about Vegas. Yep.
We did talk about Vegas and Freedom Fest and that type of thing. So everything kind of looks normal enough at the moment, but I don't know what it's going to be like next week.
Yeah, I would say the biggest obvious difference walking around is that there's a lot lower mask usage than there was a year ago. Like, that's clearly a difference, and for the better.
Well, and there's a lot less international travel. I mean, there's no travel to speak of from Australia or New Zealand to anywhere, or China or Hong Kong to anywhere. And most international travel is still down on the order of 50% from pre-hysteria levels. I mean, it's close to zero in those places I mentioned. So is it going to recover? So there are changes, there are differences already.
Doug, what are your favorite handguns?
Well, listen, I've got to say I'm old school, and I've come to love the 1911 45. I mean, it's just tough to beat. I mean, those guns are just great. Yes, they're only single stack magazines with only 8 rounds, including one in the chamber. And you can make an argument, well, the 40 S&W is a better round, and you can get one more in a single stack. And there's all kinds of things that can be done. But that's my favorite. I've got a lot of Browning 9mm high powers. That lots of manufacturers, and they differ in this and that, like them. And, I've actually come to like Glocks. I've come to, because they're so damn simple, and simple is good. Yep. It really is. And I don't like the double action trigger pull very much. I like the single action, potentially, the hair trigger possibility and things like the government model. Fan of Glocks. Everybody says that the SIG, I forget the model number, is the hot setup. And I guess you've got one, and I'm getting one in Uruguay.
Yep. The one I have is it's called the M17. It's the Army designated issuance of the P320, I think is what it is. But yeah, it's a nice handgun. I like it a lot. It's easy to, you could see why, when they're making a standard sidearm for the military, they have to dumb it down and make it as simple as possible. And enable so that everybody can qualify on it. And so it's a very easy gun to fire, and it's very easy to be accurate with. And it's kind of almost, it's idiot resistant. Let's put it that way, which I like.
Yeah. So I guess my suggestion would be go to a range and fire a whole bunch of guns, because ammunition is still relatively cheap in the U.S. and available, like in Uruguay. What were you saying, that a .308 round costs $4 in Uruguay.
$4.
Shocking. And I don't know what a 9mm round costs down there.
Yeah, I don't remember what that was now.
Sounds like it would be $1 anyway.
I think it's probably more like 70 cents, but it's still a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. So my suggestion when it comes to guns is go to a range and just drop a few $100 and rent a whole bunch of guns and try them out and see what you like best. Told you what I like, but your results may vary and your preferences will too. That's why there's, scores of different guns out there. I mean, the one gun I really don't like, because I don't like that gun that the US military adopted, that Beretta.
Oh no, that's why they finally got rid of it and replaced it with the SIG. Finally.
Yeah, who got bribed to make that acquisition? That's my question.
So many complaints about that.
Yeah. So you gotta and buy a bunch of guns. The ones that you like, buy a bunch of them. I mean, unless they try to steal them from you, at which point you're gonna have to decide, hopefully, where to bury them for future reference, along with a bunch of ammunition. But can't go wrong buying a bunch of handguns.
I agree. I think they're only going to become more valuable, more expensive, and the ammunition's, now it's inexpensive in the US again. They have certain periods where it goes up a lot. So, now's a good time to buy it. It's cheap.
Yeah, go to some places like you can Google, I guess military shooters is pretty good. And get lots of different calibers. Get a case of everything that you can imagine, 762 Russian, 223 for the AR-15, 9mm, 45 caliber, 40 S&W, 22 long rifle. That's a very good choice.
Yep.
So, and a bunch of shotgun shells too. Yeah.
Okay. Just one more question for you, Doug. Why does it seem that the World Economic Forum is going after Europe and the US and Canada and Oceania, all those like Western nations, I guess, as opposed to Mexico and Central and South America?
Perhaps that's where the power lies. I mean, Europe and North America is where all the capital lies. How many members of the WEF are from Oriental nations?
Well, that's a good question. I'll look into that. I'm not really sure. But it does seem to me, I mean, they are trying to do things in, not just in Western nations. And the biggest proof of this is what's happened with Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan project was something that was cheered on by the World Economic Forum with their going all organic. And, they were basically following the template from the World Economic Forum. So, Sri Lanka doesn't classify as a Western nation, and they totally embrace the World Economic Forum's ideas. So I think they are everywhere else. It's just we might notice it more because we're Western nation people.
Yeah, Klaus Schwab has got to be an organizational genius, if nothing else. He's actually, found a bunch of like-minded people. In other words, the kind of natural-born sociopaths that run governments. They all think alike. Their interests are the same, and gotten them together so that they can collude and reinforce each other. It makes all the sense in the world, actually. He's actually a genius. I mean, it's perverse. I love that picture of him. I presume it wasn't fabricated, but who knows, where he's in this little bikini bathing suit.
Yeah.
Which is really kind of unseemly for somebody in his late 70s to be wearing a bikini bathing suit. And then his Ming the Merciless costume.
Yeah, it's Cobra Commander. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe they fabricated that too, but we're dealing with an aberrant personality. And I think we've talked in the past about the fact that his court jester / court intellectual, Noah Yuval Harari, or whatever the guy's name is, wrote these two very pedestrian books that they got reviewed by every important publication in the world that establish him as one of the world's geniuses who can endorse everything that these people are actually quite clever, how they cover all the bases and, reinforce each other. It's, are they going to win? God.
Every time I hear someone bring it up, everyone's like, they're not going to win because what they're doing is not good, and there's too much hubris and things like that. So I mean, most of the people out here who are more on our side of the fence would say, oh, they're not going to win. I've seen no sign of that so far. I mean, if anything, they've completely outthought, outplanned, out executed every other approach on earth. And I certainly hope that they lose. I think they ought to lose if there's a universal justice in some way, like they will lose, I guess. But I mean, I think we've only underestimated them. I have not seen anyone overestimate them so far.
You're right. And everybody on our side of the barricades, you've got well, I've got to say, people like ourselves, you and I, and some of the people listening to this are very stalwart, but most of the people that are opposed to them are just kind of, I don't like them very much. I'm going to vote Republican in the next election, which
Right,
is a
exactly.
gigantic, and that's about as far as it goes. And most of the Republicans are actually, they're worse than worthless. They're worse than the Democrats in many ways, as we've discussed in the past. So yeah, it's God. I hate coming to all these grim conclusions. I'd like somebody out there to give us some arguments why we're wrong. I mean, that'll be good.
Right. Yeah,
I'd
love to hear.
appreciate that very much.
Exactly. Especially if you have specific ideas as to why you believe that the drivers of the Great Reset will fail, I'd love to hear. I'd love to
Yes.
hear because I'd fully endorse any idea that gets to that end. I think the best thing, my hope, and this is just relies on hope, is that what they're trying to do is so unnatural, like so anti-human and and top down. And I don't like the top down stuff often fails for a whole number of reasons, because it just, a lot of times it defies the natural order of things, defies human nature, that they will overreach at some point and and cause a collapse. And that collapse will be extremely messy for them and everyone else. And what comes from that in the end, maybe something better. But that really is hope. It's like it's almost believing that Trump will save you, kind of a hope, which is never going to happen.
Well, maybe I'm going to have a cigar later today, and I'll pretend that it's not tobacco, but it's hopium that I'm smoking.
All right. Do that, Doug. Thanks a lot. I guess we'll talk to you again next week.
Yeah, it'll be a pleasure, Matt. Have fun out west.
Thank you. I will.